Right. Hi, everyone. Let me start again.
I don't feel so as nervous now because I'm like, oh man.
Yeah. Right. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Story Coaching Podcast. I am so excited because we have K E Barron today, who is the author of the Bloodstone Dagger series, and we are going to be talking about world building. So, hey, Katie, how's it going?
Really great. So glad to
Awesome.
be here.
I am so happy that you're here doing this because I, of course, have read your series and you have this incredible world. I mean, it's just this vast, complex, it's like a real world that you step into, and I just wanted to chat with you and get some of your secrets. So
Okay.
tell me about the worlds behind that series. I mean, how did you develop it? How did you build it out to what it is today?
Well, okay. I'm going to be honest here, and hopefully this won't be too embarrassing. um,
No,
so
so
the inception for the world I created, it started essentially when I was a child, and it's something that I've worked on just in my head for my entire life. And so it goes all the way back to a little unknown game called Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
oh yeah, I love Zelda.
So hardcore fans may even see it in my current work, but maybe not. Hopefully not too much. um, yeah, I was so enamored with this game growing up
Yeah.
that I obsessed over it. I would write little stories in the world. Sometimes I would use Link and Zelda as the characters. Sometimes I would come up with other characters and just come
Right.
up with different stories. And every time I played the game, I would try to, pretend I was in a different story. And I don't know, it was an obsession with mine. It's currently an obsession with my little niece with Breath of the Wild. So it's neat to
Awesome.
see that being passed on. My Breath of the Wild is, of course, Ocarina of Time, and all the other games leading up to Breath of the Wild,
Yeah.
which is still like one of my favorite games. Um, and then grow as I was growing older, like into my older teenage years, there's more games that come up. So there's a lot of different fantasy games that I've played over the years that I've added into this hodgepodge world that started developing, and I started coming up with characters in that world, which were mostly just still Link and Zelda. It was a fanfic, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
We
and
all
then
started
when
with
I
fanfic somewhere. Yeah.
yeah, and I was like, there's no shame in that. Nobody should ever be ashamed of a fanfic because that's how imagination gets going.
I love, yeah,
So
I think fanfic is so healthy for like young writers.
Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah.
And before it wasn't, people would say, oh, you really need to come up with your own stuff. Stop copying. And it's like, and at the time I felt like you have to keep it to yourself. Like, oh, I'm copying. It's not good.
Yeah.
But
No,
that is
such a good
but
exercise
that's
in,
how people learn,
yeah.
right? They copy first and then they learn like, what is it about this that works? And they can apply it to other
Yes.
things. So when I was in a university, of course, then you start learning more about the world and you go, into the working world. And
About the
so
real
like
world. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I have some background in like economics, and like I have interest in anthropology and other like sciences like that. So it really also helps to understand what makes, economies work, what makes,
Right.
some little things of political things like that. I'm not really a political person, but that is all part of that.
Yeah. To see the history and the culture of the real world.
And then of course history. My family is like big history buffs, they like to call themselves. Although I would just say history enthusiasts is what I say. Like I wouldn't call myself a buff because I forget a lot of stuff. I have to constantly research everything over and over
Right.
again. But I'm interested in it so much that
Yeah.
I want to put it into my stories. And but the game thing, I feel, is the key for me because unlike growing up, you had your never ending stories, you have your Lord of the Rings and all that, which are great worlds, but they're all very similar in they have that same feel to them. I feel like there's that medieval elves kind of fantasy, which
Yes. Yeah.
which obviously tantalizes the mind. but you don't get to see as much of that like diversity of cultures that you
Mm,
get in games, honestly. Like every game has these these different biomes that you explore with
yes.
different kind of, different kind of creatures, different kind of races. And
Yeah.
that actually I feel and tickled my imagination a lot more because you're in the world literally playing, and you're exploring it on your own and
Yes.
interacting with it a lot more than you would in a book or in a passive kind of.
Yes. And you have the visual too,
Yeah,
I think. But yeah, I remember Zelda has like it's been a long time, but I know there's the water world and there's the
yeah,
field and there's the castle area and there's like a volcano and
yes.
they're just
and,
like all so different.
and you
And yeah,
can
you're right. You can
imagine
learn
different
on
cultures, like what would a culture living in this place be like, and that's how it sort of develops. So um and then you can create religions out of that. Like if you live around a volcano, what's your religion then going to be? It's obviously probably going to be worshiping this volcano, or it's going to be related to that in some way. And
yeah,
then you have, you know other places that, this place is a vast this these people have a vast landmass. Like, well, how did they get there? Oh, they're probably imperialistic. And like, so these kind of things start to come together once you have, the imagination from your childhood mixed with the realistic kind of education that you've had
right.
throughout your life. And so that's basically that's
Y-
basically the secret of conceptualizing the world. Is just
Right.
there's something probably back in your childhood that made you go like, oh wow, you
Right.
know,
So
that's
like
really where you should start.
yeah, some visual, some sort of inspiration, and then you just start kind of riffing off of that with knowledge about how things would work in this world and kind of extrapolating out
Yeah.
into that. Do
And
you
so a lot of my stuff does definitely draws from real world history as much as I can,
yeah,
while understanding that that could lead to some controversies, but
yeah,
you can't avoid it. I feel it's kind of, history is real, and it belongs to everyone. And, you know, so I feel like I'd rather ground my stories in some form of reality, a realistic foundation first, that then
right,
you can say, hey, like, or why did you write it this way? Well, the Ottomans in 190 whatever. Yeah, not that
right.
I've written that, but you can say that that's what happened.
Yeah.
It's not.
I mean, do you have an example that you'd be willing to share of maybe like an element in one of your stories that you took from idea and then pulled some of that research or real world knowledge into and just like what that process looked like?
Yes. This is the example that first came to my head, although I don't think it's the best one, but
Okay.
I do have, like, I do draw a lot of from Middle Eastern culture, and but I try to keep it more in the, it's hard to say. I try to keep it pre-Islamic, which is very difficult to find.
Right.
Lots of information about pre-Islamic. Mostly it's just Persian Empire that you'll find a lot of that. So I have used a lot from Persian Empire, as well as other cultures around that area. But um, so like one of the inspirations I took for the religions was a little bit of Zoroastrianism, which is still around. People still, um, but it's a extremely minority religion now in that area.
Yeah.
But it's been around for a very long time, and so there's these tribesmen that, they look at the dichotomy of like fire and water, and that's a big part.
Okay.
And then I found information, I'm not sure, it's not necessarily related to Zoroastrianism, but in that there's also the cultures that a lot of burial rites, it's because there's a desert, they could, instead of like burying their dead, they would leave them in these towers where they would kind of decay up there, and the desert heat would suck up the moisture, and it was like a kind of weird sort of mummification that happens. And
Oh,
then
no.
oftentimes vultures will pick at them, and that was actually considered, you know a,
That's a positive
a
thing.
normal way to, yeah. So then I was thinking, oh, I have this grave city ruins that I put in, where there's lots of bones and bodies like all up into these towers, but it's so old and crumbled and that nobody uses it anymore. But So just
Right.
just little things. I try not to base too much on stuff
Yeah.
for the plot. Like I try to come up with as much on my own as I can, but you want to
Yeah.
just sprinkle some
But yeah,
real
what
world
what a
history.
neat
Yeah.
detail, because I remember reading that and being like, "Oh, that's so."
But it's something that really happened to some,
Yeah,
at some point in time. So it's not completely out of the question to like,
yeah,
like we're gonna leave our bodies out in the desert to be picked up
yeah.
by
They
vultures.
Yeah,
Like,
that was
yeah.
a real, I guess, decision that people had made at one point, so why
Yeah,
couldn't they make that decision in a fictional world too?
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Very
you'll find that everywhere. Like there's really not a whole lot. If you can imagine it, humans have done it. That's my understanding. Like somewhere in history, someone has done it if you can imagine it.
Right. Because someone else has imagined it and done it.
And even if you can't find a lot of evidence for it, it's probably just because it didn't work and everyone died who did it. But someone had to have done it and to have died to then teach the world that that's not how we do it.
Right. How we learn,
Yes.
how our culture
Like
develops.
that's sort of evolution. Like that's another big one of my big loves is evolutionary biology and like seeing how like, like that bird has a beak like that because that was the one that survived. So then you have to imagine what all the other beaks may have looked like before that to get to that beak or
Right.
to
Yes,
get to
yeah.
that wingspan. Like it's so cool. It's just so cool to think about. And cultures are the same way.
Yeah.
So
Because of course your books have five different species or races,
um
maybe more, 6?
oh, there's always more. I would
Yeah.
say at least in the Bloodstone Dagger, there's probably about 5 main ones. Yeah.
Right. And I know I won't give any spoilers, but I know that there's like a very interesting origin story of where they came from
That's a spoiler.
and how, yeah, and then just interesting to see, like, because you talk, I think, a little bit about the history of how they came to be
Yes.
how they are now. So
Basically the way the world is established at first is that humans kind of just came around and nobody has an origin story for them, and so that's
right,
part of what is explored. So these other creatures that were ancient cultures at the time are kind of like, what's going on, who are these people? And they just sort of came upon them, and so each one has their own history with humans that is very mysterious.
cool, yeah, excellent. All right, so let's talk a little bit. So I mean, of course, the podcast is for new and aspiring writers or people just looking to improve their craft. So can you give some tips for someone maybe just starting to build a world, or even someone that's just embarking on a new series and wants to build up a big world, and whether it's fantasy or sci-fi or even in the real worlds, but like an urban fantasy or even just a regular old world. Can you give some tips for where to start and how to develop that complete seeming world, or the sense of a complete world?
Yes, play more video games.
Yeah.
No.
Noted. Excuse me, I have
No.
to go.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not what everyone has to do. Probably my answer would be a little more of a cliche thing is
Right.
write what you know. Um, but not in the way that people think. It's just
Yeah.
your jumping off point does need to start with what you know. For me, I knew Legend of Zelda.
Yeah.
I knew it like the back of my head, played it a million times.
Right.
But for some people, it might be just like your hometown. Like if you look at some of the street signs or the neighborhood names and like, how can that be tweaked to be now it becomes a kingdom, right? Now it becomes this like a tribe in a post-apocalyptic landscape or whatever you want to do. And then think of like the neighborhoods that are around you, like, oh, what kind of people would live in this neighborhood? Is it like rough? Is it maybe impoverished? And then, or is it ritzy? And like, so then you can picture like the type of people that would live there. Or even just thinking of the dynamic between like growing up where you had a rival town where you play
Right.
sports with, and it's like what kind of people would live in this rival town, and now extrapolate that across like, well, now they're barbarians. Right?
Right.
Like
Yes.
take those feelings that and turn them into something, and then that it comes from a place that's legit, like it comes from a place that you really know, even if it's completely made up after the fact.
Right.
um and
Yeah.
that's another thing I'm looking to do with another. When I'm done with this world, I have plans for a new world that is going to be based off of my hometown, because, and you live in the same town as me, let's be
Yes. Yes.
honest here.
Yes,
So
I know the town well. So
yeah, so we both live in a place called Rosedale. It's a huge neighborhood. Rosedale sounds great. Like, and to me, I'm like, there's a country. It's the country of Rosedale. Or, what kind of people live in there? Probably
yeah,
fairies, or, so that's the stuff I'm starting to think about.
right.
Um, Although I haven't even considered like if it's even fantasy or if it's something else, but
Right. But just
it's
taking like that town map and kind of like just playing with it so much
yeah,
that
because it really is like, oh, these could be nations, or these can be, districts, if you want to get into that kind of a story. And what is that place known for? Some places are more vegetative, some places are a little more like swampy.
right.
Like we live in a swampy kind of area, or
Yeah.
south of us is swamp and the houses are sinking. Like,
Yes.
cool, that's a neat
Mhm.
idea for, the swamp people that are living in these like, sinking houses. Like, who knows? Like,
Right, right.
so
And
that's
you had
part
mentioned
of,
like the
yeah.
name too. Like I read something, I heard something the other day that was like names are really important because they already give you a sense of what something or a person is going to be
Yes.
like. So just taking that name like
Actually, it's
Rosedale.
interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of my initial character designs were from fan fiction and based in the Zelda universe, mostly some other games and other
Yeah.
stuff like that. Um, and so when I go to name these characters, I kind of take the essence of those names and change it enough.
Yeah.
And then that character just suddenly comes to life. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's like, oh, this is a duke. Oh, I'm gonna make this duke now. And like
Yeah.
he just becomes this awesome new character
Yeah.
who's like very business savvy and politically savvy, just from naming him. Like that's all you have to do sometimes.
Yeah. You just start to get a feel and then you just keep building on it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so same with your world, like just start with something, even, or if you're into D&D, I know that, I mean, people who are into D&D are pretty much set, I feel, for writing
Yes.
books. If they want, if you have a lot of practice coming up with stuff, you should be able to come up with a world in like a fraction of the time that it took me from
Right.
childhood.
And so what kind of aspects then are people thinking about? So they've decided, they've used their town map and they've made, the kingdom here and the swamp here, and they've got the names, but then what are they now thinking about? You'd mentioned the people that are living there and what those people are like. But then, we talked a little bit about like religion earlier.
Yes, like your
Yes.
religion, I was like, as someone who used to be very religious and is also very interested and still in it, but considers myself not religious anymore. I can look at all of them with a sort of different eye than I was able to in the past, and
Yeah.
you see a lot of practical things in religion, and sometimes you're like, right, like if you're not religious, you might be like, it seems like
Yeah.
hogwash or whatever. It's all like
Yeah.
it's unreasonable, but I'm like, no, there's methods to it. There's a reason why, like even
Mhm.
something like circumcision, which is a religious practice of
Yeah.
quite a few people on this planet, might seem crazy to anyone who's just looking at it from a surface level, or looking at it on the religious level. Like, God told me to cut off a foreskin. I hope you can keep this.
All good.
God told me to cut off a foreskin, therefore, and it seems ridiculous. But then when you really try to go back and like, okay, where do these people come from? How did that idea happen? What was the climate they lived in?
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is fact, but if you go you go back and it's like they lived in desert climates. It
Yeah.
was dry. There's sand floating around. There's
Yeah.
there wasn't as much. I mean, they were very clean, but it was harder to keep certain areas clean if you were a dude.
Yeah.
And
And
think
so
of
the
the
practice.
advantages of not having to worry about stuff when you're a tribe of people. And it makes sense to then take these benefits and mold it with your god in order to get everyone to follow along with something
Yeah.
that actually probably had a very practical purpose.
Yep.
And then it gets lost after a point, because once it gets into tradition, it just continues. It's a very powerful thing that moves cultures forward, and it can sometimes hold them back, but that's the beauty of religion, is that it changes all the time.
Yeah.
So, and it really, so you can actually form a religion in a backwards way when you say, okay, well, if these people again live in a volcano area and this volcano goes off at random, really, like they can't
Mhm.
always predict it, how is their religion then going to help them explain that? And
Yes.
how did their stories develop out of that? Because so I have, of course, you probably read my story, Eye of Arishta, and it's all about the volcano god.
Yeah.
And they have
So good.
different periods of time, like thousands, some years apart, where this is the age of man, this is the age of kings, and they are broken up by the volcanic eruptions.
Mm.
So, because each time a volcano erupts, it destroys everything. So
Destroys
they have
everything
to kind
and
of,
they rebuild.
they come up with a new system that is stronger than the next in order um, to have,
Yeah.
so it eventually ends up going into authoritarian kind of regimes,
Yeah.
because they're living in a kind of vicarious place that is a little bit depressing. There's ashfall everywhere.
Right.
They're in these mountainous extreme regions where they have to kind of use these extreme methods of order to
Yes.
survive there.
Yeah.
And then you've got just down south in the forest region, where it's just this bountiful, beautiful forest. You have the Fey Ren people, who are more like, oh, a little more relaxed and one with nature, and they didn't develop a society, and then that makes them vulnerable to other societies that want to take their resources.
Yes. And they've never had to deal with a volcano.
No.
So
And
the climate and the
so,
environment that they
yes.
grew up in with the trees is just, it promotes that more relaxed, kind of one with nature attitude that they
And
have.
you look at history in real life, when cultures that have lived that way more or less are very vulnerable to diseases, because they don't have, and so like that's another thing that I incorporated in my book, is that these people were ravaged by plague in the past, because of the invading armies had more resistance to these germs, because germs come from usually horticulture kind of animals and domestication of animals. So
Right.
cultures that did that tend to be, they would tend to bring the diseases in. It was never the other way around, very rarely the other way around.
Right.
Unless you lived in a place where, in more of a swampy place where maybe mosquitoes carry stuff. But if you live in a very mild climate where there's not a lot of disease carrying animals around, and you're not living amongst them all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be the ones vulnerable to disease. And so that also affects how the culture turn out.
Yeah. And I think, another example was, I know your main character is very good with a bow because he grew up in this wooded area
Mhm.
where he's probably had to hunt most of his life with a bow, I would guess,
Yep.
compared to someone that grew up in a more agricultural society
Yeah.
where, food was farmed for them.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good thing, because it wasn't something I consciously really thought of a whole lot.
Right.
For me, it was more because he had really good senses and eyesight, that he was just, his comparative advantage with a bow was just much better.
Yes.
But it becomes almost an unconscious process when you think about it, because yeah, he spent his time all in the forest. He would have been able to build himself some kind of bow or some kind of weapon to hunt, and then
Yeah. So for the characters, I mean, it's where what did they grow up
yeah,
knowing and experiencing and doing?
they probably didn't have as much access to steel, so they wouldn't be able to make as much in the way of steel weapons until the invaders would come, right? So yeah, no, you're right. That's it. So it all
Yeah.
ties in
Everything
together.
starts to tie and then looking back historically, I mean, what events have happened? So you mentioned like the plagues that, if I recall, are affecting how they're reacting to newcomers into their wooded area.
Yeah.
So they've
So
experienced
yeah.
something and now they're trying to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, so and this leads to like weird superstitions that pop up. So you have a culture that traditionally has never had to deal with much disease. And I also made it so they have like this midwife
Yeah.
regime, in a way, for lack of a better term, that is very effective. And so they have very low child mortality rates traditionally, and they have herbs and other healing things. So they're actually incredibly healthy people. And so when they're met with this like onslaught of
Yeah.
germs in their history, they have a hard time. They'll see where like some children will, because like in this particular disease, children are a little more resistant to it. They don't get as sick. Babies don't
Right.
really get sick.
Yes.
So a lot of orphans, like parents would die leaving these orphans alive, and then people go like, what's wrong? Like there's something cursed. And so they form this superstition that these kids are cursed and they need to be shunned because you have to keep them away. So there's lots of orphans running around in
Yeah.
this place because they don't know, it's not in their.
Yeah, so they don't always
Yeah,
necessarily process things in a way that would be logical to us
yeah.
too. Like the
So
culture will come up
when
with its
you, yeah,
own superstitions, which is another great point.
yeah, and that's why I try to make sure that all my cultures, and it's with the Feyren in particular, because I I consider them like they're like my good guys.
Yes.
But I
I like
have to
reading about
make
them.
sure that I keep like, no, they're not all good. Like they not, and then of course there's the bad cultures, the imperialists, who have a lot of good guys there too. So I try to keep it where it's like humanity is nuanced like that. You've
Yeah.
got good
And
people and
there's
bad
that
people
difference
everywhere.
between the culture and then the characters
Yes,
from that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So
Cool.
it comes all, yeah, it all trickles down to the individual anyway. So
Yeah. And then I guess, I mean, we're talking about, I think you could just go down this like endless rabbit hole of history and beliefs and why the culture is doing all these different things, and their different traditions and their the things that they're good at and the things that they're bad at and the things that are right that they believe and the things that are wrong that they've wrong quote that they
yeah,
believe. So I mean, how do you know what to include and what to maybe just kind of like pass over or glaze over a little bit more?
I have a lot to say about this.
Great.
Because I've gone through a lot of learning. I've had a lot of learning experiences with this, and I think every author can probably relate.
Yeah.
Um, that when you're starting out, it's very tempting to put everything you can think of
Yes.
about your world into the
Yes.
story. I've actually have read or known of people who their first book, they actually have said to me, oh, this is just to build the world, and then the next book's going to tell the story. I'm like,
Oh.
no, 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 no.
Oh no.
Like, no one's going to read your next book if you do that,
Yeah.
because so
Ugh.
like it's always less is more, less is more.
Yeah.
And I can't stress it enough, because I've read too many books where it's like every few paragraphs it's, here's the history of this king, here's the history of this thing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't connect to anything, because, and in your mind of course it does, it's like, this is my world, I've researched this, I put all this work into it, and it's so interesting.
Right.
Isn't it?
Yes.
And I'm like, and I'm going to tell you, no, it isn't. No one thinks
Yeah.
it's interesting,
It's
and it
such a good
hurts.
point. Yeah, for
But
for writers, I mean, it's so fascinating, and you start asking these questions about your culture, and you get so like jazzed on
oh, yeah,
on creating all this stuff, but until you have like an emotional connection to it, until the reader has a way to connect, which is through the story and the characters, it's just a bunch of facts and
yes,
information.
a
And
reason, the reader needs a reason to care.
yeah.
um and like the world detail it has to matter to the character and the plot. And I want to also discuss, like, in your pick up the pen challenges in
Yeah.
your right now courses, and also because you helped me a little bit with some of my edits,
Yeah.
um and I've been told like time and time again, like, info dumping bad, make sure that whatever you put in has to matter to the plot, it has to have a reason for the plot, it
Yeah.
has to, and so I've always done that. But what I never really thought of is it also has to be connected to the character, which I was like,
Yeah.
oh, because it's not enough to even have it connecting to the plot, because you'll have like these facts that are pooped out, and then you know, you might want to say, or do you really need this? It'll go, oh yeah, that comes into play later. That's the, you know, that's foreshadowing for this and this. It has to stay. And then you're like, oh, fair enough. But then it's still not enough because it won't matter if people forget it, right?
Yes.
So yeah, if they're just going to forget it because it's just this weird passing fact that doesn't seem to connect to anything. But
Yeah.
once the character connects to it, because or whoever's telling the story in their point of view, then you're like, oh, like you'll remember it a little bit more. It'll kind of be this like, oh, in the back of my head now, I'm like, he did react weird to that thing.
Yeah.
So when it comes up again, you're like, oh, that thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And so
So
that,
powerful. Yeah.
and I think I've been doing that largely mostly on accident because I already know to write things that matter to the plot, which tend to matter to the character.
Hopefully. Yep.
But there's some ways that you could still strengthen it to say, no, the character has to react to it too. It can't be just like he's walked by a vase with this blah 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 colors and then with the intention to bring the vase back later. It's like, no, he walked back this vase, he noticed the colors. It reminded him of his mother or something.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wore a dress that looked like this. And then it's like, oh, the mother with the dress, like you kind of get a connection. So yeah, that I thought that was like even better to go that step further to connect it to the character, which will automatically connect it to the plot in that case.
Yeah.
But although not necessarily, you could connect everything to your character, and if it still doesn't connect the plot, it still has to go.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's tough because yeah, sometimes you really want to sprinkle this like interesting fact, and you just can't. You just got to keep it in your encyclopedia on your own.
Yes.
And as soon as something happens in the story, you're like, oh yes, this will be relevant now. Yeah. So
yeah, it's true. I mean, you are always going to know more about every feature of your story than actually probably gets included.
yeah. Or
Just
like even something like, and if you need help, like how do I connect it to the plot? Just, you know, if you feel like you need to say like King so and so is the fifth in line in a long dynasty of blah 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 of kings in this world, and then you just, you know, how about you make like, oh, the fifth king is prophesied to be sacrificed to the gods. Now you have a good reason to care for why he's the fifth king. And so
yeah.
So you just gotta kind of, it's hard, like let's just be honest, like
Yeah.
you gotta find reason, you gotta do the story first, just keep it about story and character first, and then once you have your developed world in an encyclopedia on your computer somewhere, I imagine,
Yes.
then you think of things like, oh, this would be a good time to chuck in a little
a little fact here and there. Yeah, and it's fascinating to me. The more that I read and the more that I study, you don't need 1,000 facts to make a world feel real and full. You really only need one or two.
Yeah.
Because the reader's going to fill in the rest, and the character who's living there is going to make it come alive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
but then it's knowing which ones you need to have available.
Yeah, and I find too that with that method, though, you end up building more things in your world that you didn't, like you find gaps that way for sure. When you find that you want to put your character in a situation, you're like, I just realized that I didn't develop this. Like, for example, this is kind of, I'll just admit this because I'm sure someone will mention it someday. So my one main character, Jeff, is a Feyren. So because he's an orphan and he's cursed, he doesn't get a family name. Now, of course, I don't do last names in my book, so it's not the same as a last name, but it's like a name given to your family that attaches you to someone so that they know you're a part, because it's a communal, or it's like a commune, like.
Right. Okay.
So in order to prove that you are part of this, you have to have some sort of connection to it, like, oh, you are, and see, and the reason I can't say it because I didn't actually develop what family names and how they work, other than that he doesn't have one.
Right.
And then now I'm at the point in my next book where he's gonna find out what it is, and I'm like, damn it.
And now I need to figure this out.
I'm like, why didn't I do this before? It just didn't, at the time when I came up with it, I came up with it on the fly, and it seemed to work really well. And then I didn't really think it through all the way.
Right.
So now I have this kind of where I kind of have to slightly retcon something now. And I don't know if anyone will notice that. So like these things happen, I guess.
Yes. I was
We're
gonna
all,
say, do you think you'd prefer to do it that way, or to spend, a couple weeks sort of thinking about everything with the
yeah,
story?
you
Or
just
would you
can't.
prefer
I
to
don't think you
keep
can
them?
because I think of tons of stuff. I have such detailed
Yeah,
notes about like my magic system and how my universe works and all these things.
right.
And then you get to a part in the plot and you're like, that's kind of dumb now that I think about it. And now you're like, I guess I'll change it now. But then you're in this vicarious position where you don't know if that is going to screw you down the road when your
Yes.
whole world's going to fall apart. So it is a bit scary.
Yes.
So I have to do a little bit of retconning, but so far it's been just little things like that. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I have to come up with something for naming. And so far, like I've been lucky enough that I haven't had any Feyre main characters that aren't orphans yet. So
So
it hasn't come up.
perfect. Yes. Yeah. So just one of those details that just hasn't become important until now.
And now I'm kind of like, oh, whoops. So yeah, it could be a crapshoot sometimes.
I think
You can do all this work on a world and it actually ends up not working when you get down to the brass tacks of the story.
yeah. But to me that seems like something quite minor. Like you can just be like, "Oh, this."
But the great thing though, and this is why, that if you put everything info dump into your books, then it's locked in. And then when you realize your universe is stupid, you've already done pages of it. Where now you're like, how am I going to change this now? As long as it's a secret with you and in this, like in the back of your head,
Yeah.
and then you want to change something who no one's going to know. And you can just go and retcon whatever you want because you didn't put it all out there in the beginning.
Yes. Excellent point.
That's
And
another good reason not to
yes.
info dump people.
Yeah, right. Keep as much to yourself as possible in case you need to change it later.
Yeah. And that's how I roll now. And it's definitely working better because I change my mind a lot. And that's,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think for the future though, for the next two books, like I want to outline them almost 100% before even starting to
Yeah.
see how that will improve the process. So
Yes.
because I didn't do a great job of outlining this series, I did a more of a, it wasn't that I pantsed it, it was more just I did one book at a time. I outlined one book at a time and then did that book. And then I outlined the next book and did that book. And then I'm running into like weird issues where it's like, uh-oh, that I
How do I
I've
make
done
this
that.
work?
Now
Yeah.
I have to make this guy go all the way to across the world to finish something that really is inconvenient to the plot now.
Yes, I should do an episode on series planning because it's
I wouldn't.
you I guess I find things go much better for me when I know exactly where everything is going. And yes, I definitely find, I'll sort of start with a basis of a world so I have an idea of where they're living, but as I work through the plot, I start seeing those areas of detail that I need, and I start seeing how maybe some aspects of the world maybe it would be a bit easier on me if I nudged it this way, or would make more sense if I nudged it that way. And I can do all that before I start writing. So I think that's a
Yeah.
great point to that you're never going to know all of your world until you start writing. And sometimes doing more detailed outlines is
Yes.
a way to kind of quote write and get through the whole story quickly without going through 80,000, 120,000 words and realizing, oh, I need to change
Yeah.
all of this.
So there's a reason why the book part 2 took 3 years, where all my other books only took one.
Yes.
Yeah. So this has been a big learning experience for me for sure.
Yeah.
This series, because it was never meant to be one. I have a series in mind, and I wanted to hold off until I've developed more skill with standalone books. And
Right.
this was going to be just one of the standalone books, and then it turned into a duology. So it's like it was going to be perfect as a duology. I was like, cool, no one does duologies. Like I could do 2 books as a
Yeah.
story of 2. And then it was like, oh, there's a reason why you don't see a lot of duologies, because you can't just wrap up everything in a second book. It needs a third.
Yes.
And now
And I know you're mentioning now maybe
is
4.
enough. And I'm like, if I just outlined it better, it probably would have, not that I regret anything I've put in them. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
it had to go where it had to go. Like, I have to let the story tell itself, because,
Yeah.
if I try to force everything through.
So I guess that's a great other question is, now looking back, are there tips that you would have or things really that you would do differently? And I mean, we talked about outlining as being something helpful and outlining the series, not just
Just this, yeah, because I
and
always outline the full books. I
yeah,
don't, but I didn't outline the series other than having just a basic roadmap, like, okay, part one's gonna be generally this part, then this arc, and then part two's gonna be this arc. But all the little details of like where characters are at this time, and you know
right.
who's gonna be reaching their arc at this, in this section, I didn't really do any of
Fair
that.
enough.
So I just knew like, oh, this book is when this will happen, but not exactly what leads up to it or anything like that, because I was like, that'll get figured out when I outline the next book. Once another one's already done and in paper, and it's like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
So, but I was told like that was the way I thought was the best way at the time, because I thought if I take too long outlining the whole series in detail, and
Mhm.
then I was going to do it where it's like, okay, let's let's write them all at the same time and then release them separate. I was like, then it would take me forever to release. So I do want to have a release out there while I'm working on the next one,
Right.
which was a risk. So I really should have outlined it more detailed if I was going to do that.
Gotcha.
But I get very impatient. And I blame NaNoWriMo. But I do, because I was each time I started a book, it was during NaNoWriMo, because I was so anxious to just get going that I would leave an outline half done or not quite done and just be like, it'll come together as I'm writing it. It'll be fine. And
Yeah.
it has worked for me in the past. So it's just one of those things. I got lucky a couple times and thought, well, just it'll come to me when I get there. And then I actually did get there, and I got stuck for like 2 years.
Yes, I would say your Bloodstone Dagger series is much more complex than the earlier books like Eye of Eriston.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the more complex, the more you need that planning, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it sounds like you've experienced that too.
Yeah.
And
So the
yes,
next
and
two books are going to be completely planned together, and they're going to be written together.
yeah,
And then if there's a way to put them into one, I will do that. So
right.
it's a nice trilogy. But if it ends up being two, at least it'll be what I'm happy with and it makes sense.
Yeah,
And they'll be done at the same time. And I might even release them at the same time. I don't know. It just
right.
depends.
Yeah.
Because at that point, it's like, who cares? I made people wait for 3 years for this part two, but maybe
Yeah.
I'll give you two in the same
Yeah.
time.
And I mean there's so many schools of thought on releasing and writing and do you do it together? Do you do it separately? So it really is just experimenting to find what works for
Yeah.
you too.
I think I'm also just ready to put it behind me as well and have more, because I want to get into more romances and do other things.
Yeah,
And so if this series can just be done, it would be great.
right.
Um,
Super. Well, we are out of time, I think, here.
okay.
So that's awesome. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Was there anything else that you maybe
I
wanted to
think
pass along about
we
world building or the world of writing and building that career?
I think we actually covered everything. I was actually surprised because I have a whole lot of more notes, but then I actually said them all already. So
Perfect.
just with in regards to history and how you can incorporate that in, we talked a little bit about that at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
And it doesn't mean you have to go out and research years and years of history, but if you know how things tend to progress with people, you can kind of bring that into your books a little bit and use those inspirations from history too.
exactly.
Right.
And I just caution people to like just do, I mean, you can't do perfect research, but do as much as you can, especially when you're talking about cultures that aren't like your own per se. But
Mhm.
I always think if you keep it historical enough, because that you can find that's more fact-based, and try to not unless you're doing a modern story. I know it's like for fantasy, that's my wheelhouse. I'm not really as well versed in like telling
Yeah.
modern stories. I think there's different rules for that when you're looking at modern cultures of today's world.
Yes.
Um, there's a little more you need to do for that. But I feel for like fantasy, you have the historical record to look at. You have and also just your imagination, and you can make up whatever you want. Essentially, you're making up your cultures essentially. Um, so, but always just try to do your research and be as sensitive as possible.
Yeah.
And because yeah,
Yeah.
but I also tell people like, do not like stand by your stuff. If you've done your research, stand by it.
Yes.
Because you know what's best for your book in the end of the day.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. And I mean, we've talked a lot about the Bloodstone Dagger series. And if I can share, I know you just released book 2. And I have read it because I helped out with some of it.
Yeah.
Do you want to plug it a little bit,
I
or
do.
let us know where we can find more about you and your books?
It's called Queen of the Scour. It's
Pretty.
part 2 of the Bloodstone Dagger. So it is just finished. It's just gone on sale. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and any online store. It doesn't, but the ebook is only through KDP, so through Amazon.
Yeah. And so Kindle Unlimited
Yeah.
then, or yeah.
So but not, so it's not on Kobo anymore, unfortunately, because Ingram, I don't want to talk about Ingram, but it's easier to do
Let's
over.
not. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
so yeah, check it out. I've got it kebarron.com. You can find all the information you need on the new releases, and I've also been part of a short story anthology, as Charlotte and
Yes.
both of us have. So you can find information about that as well, where I try a little bit of sci-fi. And
Yeah.
so far, no one's pointed out anything embarrassing about it yet, except for one story that I did collaborate on, which is
There were some funny typos in one of the stories.
Which
you'll all good.
probably learn in a different podcast. Yeah.
Yes.
And that was one of mine that I should have figured that out. I should have seen, but
live and learn. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I would highly recommend for anyone who's listening to have a look at Katie's books, because they are awesome. Yeah, and I mean, you heard a lot about the world today, but it is this fabulous fantasy world with all of this big underlying mystery of where humans have come from. And I guess I really don't want to give too much away.
But more than that, I always like to plug the fact that if you like sexual content with your fantasy, but not where it's like overshadowing everything else, and you also like melodrama, like the things that make you go, oh, I hate him, like those kind of books that I feel like in some ways are lacking today in entertainment, where it's like they don't make us hate the characters enough or love the characters enough, and sometimes and I recommend, I'm not, obviously I'm a little biased, but I do love melodrama and fantasy. So I know not everyone might, I guess, but for those of you who you know what I'm talking about, check it out.
That's a good point. They are adult books.
Yeah.
Which adds this whole new level that you don't necessarily see a lot of in fantasy. I mean, it's
things like
Game of Thrones level.
You're my what? You're my father? No, I'm his father. Like that kind of stuff. The stuff that used to, that you'd see on the Stars Network. Remember Spartacus? Yes, Game of Thrones. Remember these things? Yeah. Oh man.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, and I will put I'll put all the links for your website and your books in the comments for this episode. Thank you so much for hanging out.
It's been fun.
Yeah.
Love talking about my world. So great opportunity.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye.